Clara sat at the dining table, going over her upcoming presentation one last time. She had read it repeatedly, looking for mistakes, but everything was in order. Her notes, spread across 3 pages, contained every key point and anticipated objection. Feeling assured, Clara realized that while her plan might not be flawless, it couldn't outright fail. She allowed herself a brief smile, but the stakes were too high to take lightly. She couldn't afford to risk it. Content with her preparation, she shifted her thoughts to timing. If she explained things slowly to David, it might sink into his analytical mind, and he could understand her reasoning and agree. But that approach would give him time to challenge her logic. After a decade together, Clara knew his mind as well as her own and understood that, in a battle of wits, he would likely come out on top. So, a gradual approach was out. That left her preferred strategy. Shock and awe. Hit him fast, hit him hard, and secure his agreement before he had time to resist. His approval was essential. Without it, nothing could move forward. That was the part with no risk. Nervously, Clara stood up and moved around the kitchen, distracting herself from the pain she knew she was about to inflict on her husband. He didn't deserve it, but without it, she wouldn't get what she believed she deserved. She had to do it. She assuaged her conscience by reminding herself that he had forced her into this corner where she had no choice. Ergo, it was his fault. Clara looked around the kitchen, trying to remember the last time she'd been there alone on a weekday. It had to be at least 5 months. Up until then, it had always been her getting home first and greeting the kids when they got home from school. Why had that changed? Simple. His name was Alex. Alex was brought in 5 months ago from another office as her boss. For the first month, they'd maintained a standard boss-subordinate relationship. That changed when he asked her to work late one day. After finishing the work, he thanked her by taking her out for dinner. They discovered they had much in common, although he was 5 years her junior and single. They shared many interests, such as the arts, movies, and fashion. Slowly, the compliments about her work and eventually her looks increased. She was flattered both as a proud employee and as a woman who was starting to worry about the effects of time on her attractiveness. Soon, it became a regular thing. Within a month, all pretense of work was dropped, and they hung around after hours just talking, either at work or over coffee somewhere. Within another month, his complaints of being lonely or hating to eat by himself led her to skip dinner with her family and discreetly go to restaurants with him with increasing frequency. By 3 months in, that included movies and shows as well. It also included many weekends while she showed the out-of-town visitor the local sights. She covered it at home by saying there was a promotion in the offing, and she wanted to stand out from the crowd by putting in the extra hours. She was only slightly ashamed by this ruse, which was made worse by her husband, David, fully supporting her newfound ambition. She knew it was wrong for a married woman to behave this way, but after 16 years of being a selfless mother, she felt she deserved to do something for herself, even if just for a couple of hours a day. When she was with Alex, she felt appreciated and more alive. Sure, her husband said he appreciated her all the time, but there were only so many ways for him to say it, so it had gotten stale over the years. When she increased her workload, David had quietly stepped up and taken over the household duties. After the 3rd time he came home to find the kids home alone, he voiced the opinion that he thought it inappropriate for their youngest at 14 to be unsupervised. Clara was still embarrassed at how she'd snapped at that, yelling at him that if he wasn't comfortable with it, he could reduce his hours. She woke the next day to find him already gone to work at 5 a.m. That night, she came home to find him already there, helping the kids with their homework and with dinner started. With only a slight tremble in her voice, she'd thanked him for supporting her career. When her weekend work started, David had risen again and taken over the main responsibility of entertaining the kids. Far from finding it a chore, he seemed to love it and rediscovered his purpose in life. The kids loved reconnecting with their dad, and much fun was had by all. Even their eldest, at 16, gave up some of his time hanging out with his friends to go places with dad and siblings. Until 2 months ago, Clara's relationship with Alex had been purely platonic. Then one Saturday, after a nice lunch and a shower of compliments, Alex had suggested getting a hotel room for the afternoon. Clara had laughed at his joke before noticing with dismay he wasn't smiling. That had shaken her to the core. She quickly made her excuses and left. All the way home, she had mentally cursed Alex for endangering their friendship by trying to make it romantic. He should have known she would never cheat on her husband. Wednesday at work was devastating for Clara. Alex treated her coldly and professionally. By the end of the week, she was really missing him. There had been no deep and meaningful conversations, no lunches, and absolutely no compliments, even though she'd hung back after work every single day. She recognized the compliments and other affirmations of her professional and womanly strengths had become very important to her ego. Sure, David was attentive and complimentary, but it just wasn't the same. Two things happened that week that should have screamed obsession to Clara. The first was on Wednesday when she came home to a partially completed dinner. David asked her to finish it while he picked their eldest up from soccer practice. When he returned, Clara was still sitting where she'd been when he left. Dinner was late. That triggered the first of their conversations. David questioned whether the focus on work was worth it. In front of the children, she chewed him out, taking all her frustrations of being ignored by Alex out on David. She'd calmed down by the time they went to bed. She denied any problems when David asked if they were okay. Before the conversation was even finished, David saw her mind was focused somewhere else. Consequently, he didn't even try for some intimacy. All the rejections were getting a little demeaning. On Saturday afternoon, Alex came and apologized to Clara. He excused his behavior as being prompted by having close contact with such a beautiful, desirable woman and being lonely. Clara forgave him but reminded him she was a married woman who intended to remain faithful to her husband. Alex responded by asking Clara if any of her colleagues would be able to relieve his frustration. This triggered every possessive instinct within her. She quickly replied in the negative. They parted good enough friends that she agreed to sneak off and take in lunch and a show the next day. The second obsession trigger occurred when Clara arrived home that Saturday night. David and the kids were packing for camping. When she asked what was going on, they replied this long weekend trip had been planned for a month. They all stared at her incredulously when she denied all knowledge of it. She simply didn't believe them when they reminded her little else had been talked about over dinner all week. In her opinion, they were unreasonable when they refused to reschedule to the following weekend, saying that this was the last long weekend before the winter set in. In the end, a disgruntled family left without her, and a very upset Clara stayed home alone. Her only solace was their absence gave her 3 days to make up with Alex. It hit her hard when, after the show the next day, Alex announced he was unavailable Sunday and Wednesday. Clara tried to contact her family to meet them wherever they were, but they were obviously in a no-service area. Clara was still upset when they returned. She didn't want to lay into David for not knowing where they had gone just in case they told her and she hadn't listened. She turned him down for intimacy that night on the grounds she had to be fresh for work. Vague alarm bells went off in her head when David suggested her ambitions were leading to her estrangement from her own family. By the time he'd recovered from the scolding she gave him over this, she was back to planning her week with Alex. She woke with a start before 3 a.m. It suddenly hit her what damage this weekend and the conversation the previous night was doing to her perfect marriage and family. She felt a chill at the thought of David leaving and forcing her to raise the children on her own. This was nothing compared to the thought of losing the wonderful, loving, considerate man she'd chosen as a life partner. Vowing to cool her extramarital friendship, she snuggled up to her husband. He felt wonderful in her arms. She considered waking him up in that special way she used to when they were much younger but decided against it. The poor man had to be up in less than 2 hours. Subconsciously, David must have felt her intimate need, so he came up for a big hug when she walked in the door later that night. Back under Alex's spell by then, Clara hardly returned it. This set the scene for the next month. Within a week, things with Alex were back to normal. Her marriage and family were as well. However, it was the new normal where the four of them laughed, joked, and interacted while Clara distractedly sat outside it all, totally unaware of the worried looks David threw her way many times a night. Finally, David cracked and begged her to give up on the promotion. He reiterated his love for her and confessed his terror at the effect all this extra work was having on their family. Unfortunately, he couldn't have picked a worse day to bare his soul. Just that day, Alex had finally re-announced his wish to take their friendship to the next level, subtly but firmly making their continued friendship contingent on her agreeing. Clara was very distracted. The thought of losing all those ego-boosting compliments made her shudder. As David begged and pleaded, Clara was debating what to do. It was a complete no-brainer. If it came down to a straight choice between Alex and her husband, David would win. But there wasn't a lot she wouldn't do to avoid making the choice. She needed both of them. One for her need for stability, the other to bolster her flagging early 30s ego. Long after her husband had lapsed into silence, Clara was using her considerable intelligence to find a risk-free solution. By 2 a.m. she had it. The very next night, she explained her plan to Alex, reiterating she would never cheat on her husband. She laid it all out. She would lure David into having a threesome where Alex would just happen to end up as the third wheel. The men had never met, so it would simply be a matter of seemingly choosing Alex at random. If that worked, she'd work on a way of getting some solo time with Alex later, with David's blessing. It wouldn't be cheating. She did warn Alex it would take a while to talk David around and asked him to be patient. Alex didn't reply immediately. He considered the time he had already invested in this pursuit. He had complete faith that once her artificial line had been crossed, the floodgates would open, and she would be his whenever he wanted her, if that is what he chose to do. Warning her he wouldn't wait forever, he readily agreed. Clara was so grateful she didn't object when he kissed her properly for the first time. She drew the line after several minutes when he firmly cupped her left breast in his hand. Angry at her own excitement, she pushed his hand away, reminding him of her commitment to be faithful. They went to dinner. She wasn't particularly nervous about raising the subject with David. They'd always been open and honest about their fantasies and had role-played more than a few over the years. She was too tired to raise it that night, preferring to relax after David was asleep. The next night, the atmosphere just didn't feel right, so she again waited for David to go to sleep. This time, as she relaxed, she couldn't help a small moan escaping. Her imagined coupling with Alex was just so enticing. With a small amount of horror, she was interrupted by David rolling towards her. "This is a bit unfair, isn't it?" "Why? What's unfair?" "You lying there pleasing yourself after knocking me back for the last few months." Clara was shocked. Surely it couldn't have been that long. "Has it really been that long, darling?" "Too right it has. Since you started going for that promotion, you've either been too tired, too grumpy, or simply told me to leave when I try to start something." Even feeling as chagrined as she did, Clara still recognized this was a golden opportunity to raise the subject she wanted to. She spent a few minutes justifying to herself the effect her obsession with Alex was having on her marriage. Then she sought a way to open the conversation. She was so busy she didn't take note when David sighed and turned away again. She realized bringing up the idea of a threesome after a 4-month drought might affect David's ego. It might imply that he alone just didn't do it for her anymore. No, the safer path was to reestablish relations with David first. She rolled towards him and tugged him to her. Once on his back, he began snoring. Clara was too embarrassed to even continue relaxing. She had to get this out of her system shortly before it did any damage to her marriage. Clara worried. Until Alex came into her life, there was absolutely nothing wrong with her marriage or her intimate life. After 2 days of inaction, Alex was a little upset with Clara. The next day, she had to kiss him again to stop him criticizing her. This time, he behaved and didn't go for a grope. It did make her eager enough to kiss David deeply when she got home and rub his back while doing it. David's eyes lit up. They didn't even wait for the kids to go to bed. As soon as dinner was over, they retired to the little outdoor shed David had built to house their jacuzzi. It was his solution to maintaining a healthy relationship as their children got older. Once inside, David was eager to please her. After her commenting on his impatience, David defended himself by saying he didn't want to give her time to change her mind. David was considerate as usual, but Clara only managed to reach her peak when she closed her eyes and remembered Alex's touch that afternoon. The next morning, Saturday, David woke her in that special way she used to love, with his kisses caressing her skin. He no doubt thought she put the pillow over her face to stifle her sounds. In reality, even with her eyes closed, she had trouble pretending David was Alex. It was a pleasant but confusing experience for Clara. That night, she felt bold enough to broach the touchy subject with her husband. After complimenting his performance over the last 24 hours, she delicately raised the idea that after so many years, they were getting a little stale, and she had become a bit obsessed with the idea of a threesome. With his open and honest outlook on life, David immediately suggested they role-play it. This was going better than Clara expected, so it was back to the jacuzzi. After every session, they collapsed on the custom-provided mattress, exhausted. In fact, the renewed intimacy with David almost made Clara give up her plan. By a week and a half into what she thought of as David's conditioning period, Alex was getting very impatient, and the compliments were definitely drying up. She found herself having to kiss him practically every day or two, just to keep him interested. Eventually, even that wasn't enough, and she felt Alex withdrawing again. She knew she had to advance her timetable. 2 days later, after another marathon session in the jacuzzi shed, Clara thought she finally had the courage to ask the question this had all been leading up to. David beat her to it. "Darling, the last few weeks have been great. It's been a huge turn-on doing you while our guest joins in. Do you think you would be open to her as well? How can we role-play that?" Clara recoiled in shock as she realized the last 2 weeks of what seemed like total connectedness had actually been a huge disconnect. "What? You think I want a threesome with another woman? Isn't that what this has all been about?" David sounded genuinely confused. Clara realized they'd never talked details. She couldn't blame him for the misunderstanding. "No, David. I was thinking about another man." "Oh." David realized there was no time like the present. Stealing her courage, she launched into her prepared speech. "Listen, honey, the last few weeks have been real exciting for me. Is there any chance we can think about doing it for real with an actual man? I mean," David actually gave this the serious consideration he thought it deserved. "Well, Clara, off the cuff, I'd have to say it would almost certainly be a bad move. I can't see any good coming from it. I thought the idea of a threesome with another woman turned us both on. I've got to tell you, the idea of you with another man does nothing for me. What if it was really important to me?" Again, David thought. "I'd have to think about it, Clara. Just thinking out loud, about the only way I would ever consider bringing in another guy would be if another time we invited another girl." "No, you wouldn't have to do anything with her, Clara." "I could." "I said no, David. The mere thought of you with another woman just makes me so angry." "Forget it, David. It's never going to happen." "Then you have answered your own question, Clara. Another guy isn't going to happen either." Clara heard in his tone the end of her plans. There was no way she was going to compromise. So David wasn't even going to think about it. What the hell was she going to tell Alex tomorrow? As expected, Alex was not a happy camper. He criticized Clara for not trying hard enough, then snubbed her for the rest of the week. As usual, Clara took out her frustrations on David. On Wednesday, Alex asked her to stay behind so they could talk. He seemed genuinely sad when he told Clara he could no longer stand being around such a beautiful woman who was unavailable to him. Her husband had forced her into a position where she had to choose between them, and she had chosen her loser husband. He respected that, even though it hurt. He kissed her goodbye, asked her to remember him fondly, and knew she would understand their relationship had to return to a professional one. He then turned to walk away. "Wait!" Alex stopped and turned. "Give me another week, please." "What do you have in mind, Clara?" "I don't know, Alex. Just give me a week to plan something." With another kiss, they parted. David noted Clara was back to her old distracted self again that weekend. He thought about her hot and cold mood swings over the last few weeks and about her recent obsession with threesomes. Now he had another thing to worry about. Why had her lipstick been smeared when she came home late on Saturday? Time to do some digging. Not having participated in any family activities over the weekend gave her more time to think. Clara excitedly cornered Alex after work on Wednesday. His eyes lit up as she explained her plan. Halfway through, he interrupted. "You know, Clara, He may want something in return for this. Well, there are things I'm willing to give him and things that are not negotiable. We'll have to see. Just remember, sweetheart, if at the end of the day he says no, I will give up our plans altogether. I'm sorry, Alex. That's just how it has to be. Alex said he did understand, and if she needed someone to do a dry run on, he was always available. With his tacit approval, Clara pretty much spent all of Tuesday and Wednesday at work planning her speech. She started with the basic premise that whatever she did had to be risk-free. Couldn't possibly endanger her marriage and family. She likened it to playing poker. She'd won a $1,500 pot and didn't want to risk it. She wanted to lock that in a time-delayed safe so even she couldn't access it. Then she could continue playing, knowing she could win another $1,500, but even if she lost, she still had the original. On Wednesday night, Alex took her to dinner for a full dress rehearsal. After the main course, he told her to give him her best shot. Well, Alex, I've decided to hit him hard and fast tomorrow night. I'll start by reminding him how much I love him. Lay it on thick about the kids. You know, how I look forward to their graduations, attending their weddings and grandkids' christenings. Then remind him about the plans we've talked about for our retirement. Alex's mind drifted at this point. Typical woman. She launched straight into the emotive stuff that would work brilliantly with another woman. They never seemed to realize men were far less emotive and more rational. Are you listening, Alex? Of course, Clara. Well, after that, I'll remind him that I gave him an opportunity to participate in me having some harmless fun. But he rejected it. I'll tell him he forced my hand and I intend on taking a lover Saturday night. Before he has a chance to process this, I'll lay it on thick about it being just fun, a bit of unemotional excitement. I'm sorry, Alex. I'll have to lie a bit there. If he wants to prove his love for me, he'll let me do it. I reckon I have a 70 to 30 chance of him saying yes right there and then. What do you think so far? Alex silently put the odds much lower than this but wasn't about to say it. He put his odds of scoring this Mila high less than 50%. But what the heck? It was the thrill of the chase that mattered. He reckoned he could have her once with zero risk. Many more times, and the risk of discovery and being sacked for having an inappropriate relationship would rise exponentially. Why do it more than once? He'd done this before and realized he'd already had 90% of the fun. But by maximizing the chances of Clara succeeding, he might get the last 10%. If I were your husband at this point, I would at least demand an open marriage. Well, he can forget that. I don't share. If he insists, I will back down straight away. Him taking another woman would end our marriage. That can't happen. You know you have the ultimate weapon to stop him, don't you? What weapon? Threaten divorce and him living in the poorhouse with no access to the kids if he insists on retaliation. No, I couldn't hurt him like that. Not even as a threat I have no intention of following through with. Why not inflict a little pain, Clara? It's his fault after all. If he'd gone along with the threesome idea, we wouldn't be here now, would we? At this point, Alex grabbed Clara's hands and looked lovingly into her eyes. Come on, Clara. You deserve this. After 16 years as a dutiful wife and mother, you've earned it. Clara looked into those eyes and felt a warm tingle in her heart. I suppose so. That's my girl. Well, don't get too excited, Alex. If at the end of this conversation I even suspect David is not on board, then I give in completely. Fair enough. So, can you see any flaws? Can you see how I can possibly lose? Alex was firmly thinking about himself as he replied. No, Clara. It's definitely a no-lose situation. He shook his head at the depth of this woman's delusions. While they were waiting for dessert, Clara added a few notes to her outline. When the meal was over, Alex walked her out to her car and kissed her goodnight. This time she didn't resist as he cupped and squeezed her breast but responded by pushing her leg into his crotch. She felt the twitching of his excitement through his trousers and almost swooned. Alex briefly thought about pressing his advantage, but that would spoil the fun. Okay, lover. I'll book us a room for Saturday night. Can we go to your place? I've never even seen it. No way. The walls are way too thin, and you'll be making too much noise. I can assure you of that. On trembling legs, Clara went home to her family. She was even more distracted than usual. At one point, she realized she was alone and everyone had gone to bed. Consequently, she slept in the next day and only woke just in time to see the kids off. She reminded them she had arranged for David's parents to pick them up for a sleepover that night and checked they had all they needed. She had arranged the day off. She had to call Alex at least 5 times to maintain her courage during the day. She knew her major Achilles heel was her inability to lie convincingly. The obvious question David would raise when given her ultimatum was, did she already have someone in mind? In front of a mirror, she practiced saying no. She intended on going out and allowing herself to be seduced. Anything else would spur questions she wasn't at all comfortable with. She convinced herself that by remaining cool, calm, and collected, she could pull it off. So here she was, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting to confront her husband, who was due any minute. It was Thursday night, 24 hours short of a much-anticipated event. The kids were overnighting at their grandparents'. Clara was totally ready. She just kept repeating to herself, shock and awe, be firm, can't lose. I deserve this. David walked in at 5:30 p.m., an hour and a half after his new usual time of 4 p.m. Clara figured he did that because he knew she had the day off. He saw Clara sitting at the kitchen table with a 3/4 empty bottle of wine. She rarely had more than one glass. So David not only knew this was a very special occasion, but that her defenses would be weak. Hey Clara, what are we celebrating? Did you get that promotion? We aren't celebrating, darling. At least not yet. Please sit down. We have to talk. To Clara's surprise, David beat her to it. I'm guessing this has something to do with the fact you've been so distracted for a long time now? Something to do with the fact you've almost totally ignored your family for the last 6 months? Something to do with the fact that apart from 2 glorious weeks, we haven't been intimate for 5 months? David, No. Don't tell me, Clara. Let me guess, you really love me, you are looking forward to sharing the kids' graduations, weddings, etc. With me, you can't wait until we attend our grandchildren's christenings and retire to live a life of love and luxury together. Despite all that, because I didn't go along with your plan of sharing you in a sneaky threesome, you intend on cheating on me with your lover. When? Tonight? Tomorrow night? David paused at this point. Alarm bells were screaming in Clara's head. David had just covered the first page and a half of her notes with stunning accuracy. If she'd been thinking rationally, she would have realized her husband thought much better in a crisis than she did. Head proved it. The 2 times head saved one of their children's lives while she just stood there like a deer in headlights. She was well and truly rattled. In a panic, she reverted to what she knew her memorized and rememorized speech. But I deserve this, David. It would just be fun, David. A bit of unemotional excitement. Something to spice things up for us. With no interruption from her husband and in her panic, Clara simply rolled into the next part of her speech, completely forgetting it was contingent on David's expected responses. It was the latest addition to the script, being Alex's suggestion of last night, and she hadn't memorized it as well as the rest. You can't sleep with other women. They'll divorce you. I could make it so you never see the kids. The courts will take all your salary for house payments, alimony, and child support. Clara stopped as the expression on David's face finally registered in her befuddled mind. It wasn't the look of hurt she'd been steeling herself to resist. It definitely wasn't the look of resigned acceptance she'd dreamed about. It was a look of thunder personified. What's his name, Clara? Whose name? Don't play games with me, Clara. The name of the guy who's been playing on your insecurities, flattering you, making you feel young again. The guy who thinks he can just take my wife away. What is his name? Clara was so far off script she was totally incapable of rational thought. She simply responded to her husband's order. Alex. But he's not like that. Not at all. How long have you been seeing him, Clara? We haven't, David. I would never cheat on you. You been seeing him, Clara? We haven't, David. I would never cheat on you. Stop lying, Clara. You've been coming home late every single day for months, going out on weekends, almost completely ignoring your family, and cutting me off emotionally and physically. Was it his idea to stop being intimate with me? His idea to invite me for a threesome just so he could humiliate me? Clara was torn between being offended and horrified. How could she prove David was wrong? No, you've got it all wrong, David. The late nights and weekends were just talking, just going to dinner together. I'm calling you a liar, Clara. What about last night when you came in with your dress all creased and your lipstick all over the place? I know what you look like after a quick session. I've had years to learn. Clara was yelling now, desperate to get him to understand. No, no, no. I haven't cheated, David. I would never cheat. It was just talking, dinners and kissing. You have to believe me, David. I would never cheat. David stopped and rested his face in his hands. Clara had never seen him cry, and she wasn't about to now. They both sat there stunned for several minutes. David finally looked up when he thought his face was no longer giving anything away. He was wrong. Clara was a perceptive woman and knew eyes closed to tears when she saw them. She was horrified she'd caused this amount of pain. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't lose. Desperately marshalling her thoughts, she remembered her script. Last page, the ultimate Gatuda fail-free card. That's it. She would give up her plans with Alex. She would capitulate completely. No harm, no foul, right? The situation was salvageable. Unfortunately, once again, David beat her to it. Well done, Clara. Your betrayal has killed our marriage and our family. Hell, it has killed me. I can't believe you threatened to take my kids away from me. David rose and slowly shuffled towards the door. Something about the way he said killed me sent an extra alarm bell ringing. It sounded so dead and final. David made it out the door and almost to his car before she recovered enough to chase after him. He hadn't given her a chance to play her Gatuda fail-free card. He had his hand on the door handle of his car before she was close enough to cry out. But I didn't cheat. David stopped dead. Without turning around, he spoke in a deadpan voice. Staying away from your family to spend time with another man while lying to us about the reason. Going to dinner with him. Kissing him. If that's not cheating, I don't know what is. Clara, it's over. Clara sank to her knees, too shocked and exhausted to support herself. She watched her husband drive off, too stunned to even cry. Can't lose. She reflexively thought back to her preparations for their confrontation. The only time the dissolution of their marriage should have been discussed was when she issued her hollow threat. It had never occurred to her David could dissolve it as well. Clara gave herself the luxury of feeling sorry for herself for a little over an hour. The knowledge she had perhaps terminally ruined a really good thing was just too big a deal to handle, and she shoved it forcibly into the background. This left another big worry in her heart. David's words as he left, but more importantly, his demeanor, had set off all sorts of alarm bells in her head. For the first time, she worried about the effect her ultimatum really had on her husband, a man she knew lived for her and his family. She was terrified he might harm himself. Would he? Shed stated plainly what they both knew in the event of a divorce. He would lose custody of the children and lose most of his pay and assets. They both knew of couples where the ex-wife refused to let the husband see his kids supported by the court system. Would he contemplate harming himself? Hell yeah, panic set in. There was no answer on David's cell. She rang her in-laws to see if David was there. He had been but was now gone. They were confused. David had only stayed a little while, then left after hugging all three of the children. Clara jumped in her car and drove around to every bar she could think of in the area, looking for his car. She was so distracted she ran out of fuel and had to call her dad to bring a gas can. He saw she was in no fit state to drive, so he took her home. Once there, she broke down and told her parents David had left her. She could see the hurt in her mother's eyes. Her father's words left nothing to the imagination on what he thought of his son-in-law. Eventually, her mother conceded the logic of Clara waiting at home and dropped her back to her car. Clara went home and, in the wee small hours, fell asleep on the couch. The nightmares finally woke her at 7 a.m. Before she could recover from the grogginess, the panic hit again. She feverishly checked her phone for messages. There were none. She dialed David's cell. It went straight to voicemail like it was turned off or dead. After all, his charger was right next to hers on the kitchen counter. She rang his work only to be told he hadn't shown. She rang the police. But when she told them why her husband had left, they said she was on her own by this time. It was 8 a.m., so she got David's address book and phoned every friend she could find a number for. Everyone said they hadn't seen him. She then literally spent all day driving to every possible place she could think of, returning to the house every 2 hours or so to see if David's car was there. It never was, and his cell continually went to voicemail. The only time reality impinged on her frantic but pointless activity was when a message arrived on her phone. It was a simple one from Alex. Hi. Room 77, 6 p.m. You know how you cringe when someone runs their fingernails down a blackboard? That's what Clara's soul did when she read that message. She buried that deep as well. The next phone call was from David's parents. They still hadn't heard anything and wanted to know what to do with the kids. Clara asked them to look after them until further notice. Returning home, Clara sat on the couch and cried and cried. She must have slept on the couch again as she woke with a start at 3:30 a.m. She wept again as the now familiar hopelessness washed over her. She tried to picture David's face but couldn't. She knew then within a logical certainty that David was dead. She felt insanity beckoning. No, she thought, I can't face that. With practiced ease, that thought was buried deep as well. With dread, Clara got back in her car. As she did, she noticed her cell on the passenger seat where she left it. There was one message from her eldest and 6 from Alex. She listened to the single one just saying she missed her mom but ignored the 6. Clara then spent the time until about 10 a.m. driving around the possible local suicide spots, looking for David's car. Bridges, ravines, any place out of the way where he could have parked his car and put a hose on the tailpipe. Nothing. Desperate, Clara rang his folks again, and with still no news from them, she called all his friends again. This time, the call to David's oldest friend, actually an old boss of his, gave her the suspicion he wasn't being totally honest. She looked up his address and decided to drive past his house to see if she could see David's car. He lived in quite an affluent neighborhood. She found the house, but there was no sign of David. As she drove away, her eyes were drawn to a distinctive Tesla 3 doors down. It was Alex's car. It was parked outside another flashy-looking house along with many others. Suddenly, the idea of getting some comfort from a man who was, above everything else, her friend, appealed to her. She parked and went up the path to the front door. The sounds of a muted party inside told her a Saturday afternoon gathering was going on. Beside the door was a panel flush with the wall with a security keypad, bell push, and intercom button. She pressed the button. The door was answered by the general manager of her company. Hello, Clara, isn't it? Yes, Mr. Bennett. I saw Alex's car outside. Could I speak to him, please? Of course, Clara. Would you like to come in? Clara thought of her 2-day-old clothes and haggard looks. No, thank you, sir. I'll wait here if it's okay with you. Sure, we'll get him for you. A little over a minute later, Alex came through the door. He took one look at Clara, then glanced around to make sure they weren't being observed. He deliberately shut the door, took Clara in his arms, pressed her against the wall, and kissed her. Clara was torn between her need for comfort and her need to blame someone for her desperate predicament. The human craving for comfort won with a compromise. She broke the kiss and just hugged him desperately. What happened last night, Clara? Where were you? Oh, Alex, it's terrible. David came home Thursday night, and it was like he knew everything. He accused me of cheating on him. I told him that we had only talked, been out to dinner a few times, and kissed, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He knew what I was going to say. He even knew I was going to tell him that I planned to be with you last night. I think he may have gone somewhere and done something stupid. No one has seen him since Thursday. At that point, the door opened again, and a furious-looking woman stormed out. You bastard! Is this what you were doing while I was waiting to move up here? We moved to get away from all this crap. You promised, never again. At this, she lost it and went for Alex's face with her fingernails. He put his arms up to protect himself on pure reflex. Clara grabbed the screaming woman to protect her friend. The angry woman, seeing an unprotected target, swung around and with a tremendous backhand, knocked her against the wall of the house. Clara's back once again inadvertently pressed the intercom button. Briefly, her cry of pain was heard in the foyer. She slid slowly to the ground, stunned. The formidable woman returned to trying to get through Alex's defenses. Suddenly, the big boss came out the door and gently but firmly grabbed the flailing woman's arms. "Come now, Mrs. Walker. Violence isn't the answer. That bitch has been messing around with my husband." "Yes, I heard, but there are more civilized ways of sorting problems out than this." He looked from Alex to Clara and back. "You too, my office, 9 a.m. Wednesday." He took Alex's wife's arm and led her back inside, closing the door behind him. Alex let out a sob and bolted for his car, leaving Clara still slumped on the ground, suffering from severe brain overload. She finally summoned the mental energy to go home. She rang her mom who, when she heard what a terrible state Clara was in, convinced her father to pick her up and bring her to her childhood home. She cried all night and slept most of the next day before crying all night again. At 11 a.m. Wednesday, the general manager of Clara's company met with his HR manager. "So, what do you want to do, boss?" "I can't really do anything until I get her side of the story. Plus, I promised Mrs. Walker that I wouldn't fire her husband until she'd made up her mind what she wants to do. I know she's taken the kids and gone to her mother's place. We can't fire Mrs. Brown for cause until we get her story. Can we?" "No, not really. But she wasn't here today or Saturday and hasn't called in sick. If we haven't heard from her by the close of business tomorrow, she is in breach of her contract and essentially fires herself." "Good. That sounds much cleaner." Did you believe his story that they never did anything intimate? Just kissed and had conversations? Who cares, boss? It's still a betrayal, however you look at it. Yes, you're right. Why can't people just be satisfied with what they have? The HR manager just shrugged her shoulders and left. By Wednesday evening, Clara had recovered enough to ring the in-laws to check on the children. She thought she had the strength to see the kids now, but didn't want to face David's parents. She couldn't stand the thought that their son might be dead, and she was the cause. She would ad-lib a way of getting them to drop the children home without facing the music. Shocked is just not a strong enough word to describe how Clara felt when David's mother told her all 3 kids had no wish to see her, and if she came over, they would call the police. Clara didn't recover in time to say anything before the connection was broken. Clara woke up very confused. She was on the kitchen floor, stiff and sore. She realized with shock she'd wet herself. She staggered to the bathroom and had a long shower. As she was drying herself, the setting sun caught her attention. It had been just after sunset when she'd made that phone call. She rushed downstairs and looked at her cell phone screen. It was 6 p.m. Tuesday. She had been out of it for damn near 24 hours. What the hell? One of the advantages was she felt fresher than she had in days. She used her resurgent energy to resolve she would take back control of her life. The sudden realization David could be dead tried to bring her down, but she managed to suppress it. One of the sources of her strength had always been her children. She decided to go to the in-laws' house unannounced and bring them back. Arriving at David's parents' place, she was surprised to see her parents' car there. As she pulled up, they were just coming out the door. They grabbed her and hustled her back to her car. Clara resisted, screaming she wanted to see her children. Her father told her they weren't there, then told her to follow them back to their place, which Clara did. When she walked in the door, her mom was putting the kettle on. "Where are my children?" "Calm down, Clara. They're fine. David has them," her father said. "You saw David? He's alive." "Of course. We've just spent an hour talking to him." "Where is he?" Her father looked at her mother. They were obviously uncomfortable. He's taking the kids to meet some people." Clara's mother interrupted impatiently. "Clara, David told us his version of what happened last week. I must say it was much more believable than that fiction you told us. We're both very disappointed in you, not to mention ashamed. What were you thinking, girl?" Clara bowed her head and remained silent. Her mother continued. "To answer your question, after you gave him no choice but to leave, David went back to work and met an old friend." "Oh God, not Emma." Emily Morgan was the daughter of the guy that owned David's company. She was an ex-girlfriend of David's and had been a minor source of worry to Clara for years. Despite David's reassurances, Clara knew they'd only separated in the first place when Deb was sent to an exclusive business college far away from their hometown. She also knew Emily Morgan was recently divorced. The look between her parents confirmed her worst fears. When she saw what a state he was in, she took David home. He needed somewhere to stay, so he went with her. He's been there since then. Clara, he came and got the kids tonight so they could meet Emma and her children to see if they all get on. David assures us that nothing has ever happened between them prior to this and hasn't happened yet. But they seem to be getting on extremely well. He can't do that. He has to give me a chance. From what he told us, Clara, he gave you plenty of chances over the last 6 months. He said he was devastated you had lied to him about working extra to get a promotion while all the time you were cheating with another man. Who can blame him? I did not cheat. Clara's father broke in. Stupid girl. Cheating doesn't just mean intercourse. He said he considered that you had cheated the first time you lied to him about working late and spent time in intimate conversation with another man, and I fully agree with him. I'll tell you, if your mother did that, she'd be out the door. He told us how you'd come home last Wednesday with your lipstick all smeared. Sounds like cheating to me. He quickly found your sordid little notes where you planned to manipulate him into agreeing to let you fool around. He said it broke his heart to see how cold, calculating, and callous those notes were, detailing the carrots and the sticks you pre-planned to use. Honestly, how could you embarrass us like that? I can't believe that you threatened to never let him see his kids and send him to the poorhouse. I didn't mean it. I was going to totally give in if he wasn't willing to go along with it. He never gave me the chance. Clara returned to silence and looked down at the table when she saw both her parents shaking their heads. In the cold glare of their disapproval, she saw things as David must have. The lies, the deceit, the disrespect, and the emotional gulf between them for months. She knew her marriage was over. Her parents gave her time to come to terms with all this. How are the kids and I going to survive without David? Clara's parents shared a sad glance. Her dad nodded at her mom. Clara, David said he'd spent the last 5 days asking himself if the children would be better off with you or him. He concluded that because of the threats you made against him, he couldn't risk it being you. Her mom looked at her dad again. He took his wife's hand and squeezed it to lend her strength. I have to tell you, Clara, we agree with him. Look at it from our point of view. If we support you, then there's a chance we won't be able to see our only grandchildren again. Clara was stunned again. They gave her the time to think. She could feel the anger mounting. So, you're betraying me? Her dad couldn't help himself. You started it, Clara. This verbal slap went over Clara's head. We'll fight you all. The courts always give custody to the mother. He can't prove I cheated. I didn't cheat. Clara, he doesn't have to prove anything. He just has to want out of the marriage. The children are of an age where the family court will take their opinions into consideration when deciding custody. I'll tell you, they were there tonight, and if the court had asked them right then, you'd never see them again. And I'll tell you, when I win, you can kiss goodbye to ever seeing my children again. With her last bridge burned, Clara ran to her car and sped off. An interim court order was handed down 2 weeks later. David's employment, relationship with his children, position as primary caregiver for the previous months, new but stable living arrangement, plus the children's wishes were added to his generous offer of visitation. Balanced against that was a bedraggled mother with no job or work references and no capacity to buy out the necessary half of the family home. The judge ruled with a clear conscience. By the time the obligatory 14 months of living apart had passed and the divorce became final, Clara had returned to much of her old self. Her parents had gladly forgiven her for the angry outburst. Most importantly, she committed to being the best mother she could be for David's fortnight. She even agreed to join David and his new fiancée for a week. When the final paperwork came through, she barely batted an eyelid when the nasty email arrived from Alex blaming her for his divorce and firing. Many nights of pondering and self-reflection had made her conclude the reason her marriage failed was that she was just greedy when she should have been happy with what she had. She seized the opportunity to try for more. Really, the only thing that marred her resigned happiness were the nightmares. Initially, they happened every night but were fading to once or twice a week. The worst was what sounded like a church choir singing, "Shock and awe, be firm, can't lose, I deserve this." Nowadays, she seemed to be able to go back to sleep fairly easily by saying to herself, well, 1 out of 4 ain't bad, is it?